This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Society. I need to remember to make the name change. And today is May 5th, 2023, and in this talk I'd like to continue a study that I started earlier this week, reading through and reflecting on ancient medicine by Hippocrates. I believe that in modern society, because of the abuses and troubles that have been brought about by modern medicine, many families will find a study of ancient medicine to be very helpful. In fact, I think that many families will find answers to many of the problems they've experienced in modern medicine. Most importantly, the unsustainability of the theory of modern medicine. When they read through and learn from this ancient wise man Hippocrates, who was called the father of medicine, but is today ignored. In this talk, we're going to read and discuss sections 3 through 6 of this work on ancient medicine. In the first talk, we had something of a general introduction to this study. We talked about the fact that there is an art of ancient medicine, that it was established by research and by practice over many, many years, and it was established in a demonstrative way by the experience of physicians. And in the ancient world, they didn't live in ignorance of how nature works or how the body works or how human diseases develop and how they affect human beings, but they had very different responses to these things, and they worked from very different principles than we'll find in modern medicine. And again, I think this is very important. We took some time in that first talk also to look at some writing from Francis Bacon on the Great Instauration, where he called for a complete renewal of the human sciences and arts, and we saw how Hippocrates warned against that. In the ancient world, he warned that anyone who claims to establish these studies or this art of medicine on any other foundation than that which had been established in the ancient world is a deceiver. And so we talked about that a little bit. In this talk, we're really going to get into the beginning of this study. So moving on from introduction, we're going to get into the actual principles of the ancient art of medicine. Just to remind you, I'm reading from an English translation that's found in the Loeb Classical Library, published by Harvard University Press. The Loeb series is very popular among classicists because it provides both the original language and the translation. You can find these books in printed copies, though they're expensive. You can also subscribe and access the Loeb Classical Library online, which is how I access these resources. But I'm reading from Hippocrates' Ancient Medicine, and we're beginning in this talk in section 3. I'll read the text, and I'll be careful to read through it slowly, and I'll reread it so that if you're listening, you can follow the content without having to look at the text yourself. So just bear with me if you find this a little bit slow. I just want to make sure that the text is clearly heard and understood before we make any comments or discuss it. So we'll pick up here with section 3 of Ancient Medicine by Hippocrates. Hippocrates writes, "To begin with, the art of medicine would neither have been discovered nor even looked for, as there would have been no need for medicine if sick people had benefited by the same mode of living and regimen as the food, drink, and mode of living used by people in health. And if there had been no other things better for the sick than these. So Hippocrates starts by discussing the origin of this art of medicine, and he says the reason why an art of medicine developed was because there are sick people. And it's important for us to understand the way that Hippocrates thought about healthy people and sick people. Today, we tend to think that a person is healthy who is not sick, who is not currently sick. But that's not how Hippocrates thought of healthy and sick people. A healthy person, to an ancient physician, is a person who, living with a normal diet and regimen of health and activity, has strength of body to resist disease. The person is positively healthy. He overcomes sources of disease and lives healthily even in the presence of unfavorable circumstances. So it's important for us to understand that concept of what it means to be a healthy person. A healthy person is a person who, living with normal food, normal drink, normal activity, a normal routine of life, has strength of body to overcome sources of disease. And a sick person is not necessarily a person who currently has a disease, but a sick person is a person who cannot live healthily with a normal diet, normal drink, normal physical activity, and so on, but needs special care. So anyone who cannot thrive on a normal course of food and drink or activity would be considered by Hippocrates to be a sick person. And a sick person is simply a person who needs to make adjustments to their diet or regimen or routine of life in order to maintain health. They need a little extra help to maintain health, whereas a healthy person doesn't need any special food or preparation or help. His body has this principle of health in it. A sick person is a person, to any degree, who needs assistance by making alterations to that normal diet and routine of life. And we're going to see Hippocrates get into that a little bit. Now, before I go any further, I would just like to recommend the Rule of St. Benedict. You can get an English translation of the Rule of St. Benedict. And I encourage you to read the sections in the Rule of St. Benedict where St. Benedict, in establishing the rule for his religious community, for men and women and boys and old men, establishes the rules for eating and drinking. The reason why I think it's important is because St. Benedict has to answer the question, what should be the normal food and drink in the monastery? And that's not an easy question. What should the normal course of eating and drinking consist of? And in the Rule of St. Benedict, he establishes the normal diet for the monks, and it's very helpful because it gives us a look at what Hippocrates would consider to be the food and drink of a healthy person. The normal food and drink that when consumed by a quote-unquote healthy person, provides everything that's necessary for health and for work. So it's good to look at the rule of St. Benedict to see what we could say the default diet would look like. And I think you'll be surprised at what you find there. And I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to encourage you to go and find a copy or read online the Rule of St. Benedict and read the chapters on food and drink. And let me know what you find there, because I think you'll find it interesting. But that gives you an idea of what Hippocrates is thinking when he talks about the normal diet that is sufficient for a healthy person. Now, if a person doesn't have that health, doesn't have that principle of health in himself, but is considered a sick person, we can see why religious life might not be possible, because it's simply not sustainable for a monastery or a convent to provide different foods and drinks and different methods of preparing foods and drinks to all of the members of a community. So you can see how not being able to partake of the normal course of food and drink puts a person at disadvantages. We could imagine a person can't go into war as a soldier unable to consume the ordinary food and drink, and this is why usually there are qualifications for military service of excellent health. So we can see why, if we learn to think about healthy people and sick people in this way and understand that healthy people are not simply people who are currently free from disease. They're people who can thrive on a normal course of eating and drinking. And sick people are not necessarily people who are currently afflicted by some disease. They're simply people who need to make adjustments to the normal diet, or the normal diet that's sufficient for a healthy person in order for them to live well. So it's helpful for us to make this distinction and think differently about what it means to be a healthy person or a sick person in this ancient medicine, and realize that it's not something bad to be identified as a sick person. It simply means that you need to learn how to make adjustments to what you eat and drink, how you prepare it, how much you eat or drink, and so on, in order to maintain health. And that's the goal in ancient medicine, is to understand how to keep oneself with our own unique strengths and weaknesses, how to keep ourselves in a state of being free from disease so that we can fulfill our responsibilities and do the things we enjoy in life. So just to get back to the text here with Hippocrates, he says, to begin with, the art of medicine would neither have been discovered nor looked for if sick people had benefited by the same mode of living and regimen as the food, drink, and mode of living used by people in health, and if there had been no other things better for the sick than these. He goes on to say, but in fact, it was sheer necessity that caused humans to seek and discover medicine. And I'd like to note here that when Hippocrates uses the term medicine, pay attention to the reading and ask yourself, what does Hippocrates mean by medicine? Because in modern society, we think of medicine as drugs, things that you use to try and remedy some problem or to free yourselves from the symptoms of some disease. We think of medicine as something that's beyond what we would consider food and drink, usually stronger, concentrated chemicals that are prescribed to us by a pharmacist. That's what we think of as medicine. And we think of a medical doctor as a person who is licensed to prescribe and administer these relatively dangerous chemicals. So pay attention to the difference in the use of the word medicine in modern medicine as opposed to ancient medicine. Hippocrates says it was sheer necessity that caused humans to seek and discover medicine because the sick did not and do not benefit by the same regimen as the healthy. So there's not one magic diet for everyone. There is, we can say there is a standard diet for human beings, for healthy human beings. We can say there's a standard diet. That's why I say, go look at the Rule of St. Benedict. He explains the standard diet. But even though this diet has nothing negative in it, nothing intrinsically bad in the diet itself, it's not sufficient for all people. Some people can't live well on that diet that is sufficient for healthy people. They have to learn how to adjust their eating and drinking to avoid problems caused by normal food. So he says, the sick did not and do not benefit by the same regimen as the healthy. He goes on and says, to trace the matter yet further back, and this is interesting, to trace the matter further back in history, I personally believe that not even the mode of living and nourishment enjoyed at the present time, so 5th century BC, he says, I believe that not even the mode of living or way of living and nourishment enjoyed at the present time by people in health would have been discovered. We wouldn't even know, he says, what a good diet is. The standard diet, we wouldn't even know what this is. Had a human being been satisfied with the same food and drink as satisfy an ox, a horse, and every other animal except a human. For example, the products of the earth, fruits, wood, and grass. In other words, men would have begun by simply trying to eat natural products, the kinds of things that wild beasts eat, and they would have found that they have difficulty eating those foods, even though they're natural. In their natural forms, there are very, very few people who could live well or maintain health by simply eating the raw, natural products of the earth as wild animals do. And so even the diet of the 5th century BC, which Hippocrates is talking about, he says even our human diet would not have been investigated and established unless we had learned that eating the natural products of the earth as wild beasts do causes human beings to become sick, causes pain, causes sickness, and so on. So we had to learn how to make use of the products of the earth in a way that was easier for human beings to make use of without any pain or sickness. He goes on to write, on these, the natural products of the earth, on these animals are nourished, grow, and live without pain, having no need at all of any other kind of living. And this is really amazing if you think about it. Here on the farm, we have beef cattle, and it's amazing to watch the cattle grow and to watch over the course of a year, maybe 2 years, watch them put on hundreds and hundreds of pounds of muscle. And all they eat is grass. And you can look at modern bodybuilding. I have a son who enjoys lifting weights and is very, very knowledgeable in these things. And he can explain how there's a certain amount of protein needed and certain kinds of protein, and he can explain everything, what's necessary to produce muscle. And yet we look out into the field and watch one of these Angus cattle just grow and grow and grow, putting on muscle from eating grass. And so we can see that the wild beasts were created so that they could get everything they need from the simplest natural products. But human beings can't do that. Human beings can't live like the wild beasts on just the raw natural products of the earth. The animals are nourished, grow, and live without pain, having no need at all of any other kind of living, Hippocrates says. Yet, I am of the opinion that in the beginning, humans too used this sort of nourishment. So Hippocrates says that he believes that at the beginning of human history, at the beginning of time, and notice we have no evolutionist here. The ancient Greeks were religious, and they understood that the world was created. There was a beginning of time. You'll never find any teaching about evolution or anything like that in classical philosophy, unless you're reading the Epicureans, whose philosophy was false. Hippocrates says, I am of the opinion that in the beginning, humans too used this sort of nourishment, the same nourishment as wild beasts. But our present ways of living have been discovered and elaborated during a long period of time. So human nutrition has developed and improved over a long period of time. He says, because many and terrible were the sufferings of humans. So in the ancient world, before his time, when he talks about in the beginning, many and terrible were the sufferings of human beings from the strong and brutish living when they partook of raw foods, uncompounded and possessing strong potencies. So when he talks about raw foods, he means foods in just their raw, natural state. Sure, for a small number of people, they might have been okay, but for most people, they caused great trouble. This strong and brutish living. The foods were raw, uncompounded, and possessed strong potencies, high levels of whatever the essential, the essential, I don't want to say chemicals, more like substances present in the foods, caused pain and sickness to people in their raw form. The same things, in fact, as humans would suffer if they used them today, falling into violent pains and diseases quickly followed by death. So we can take a simple example here and understand what he's referring to. We know that there are poisonous foods, poisonous berries and things like that. We identify them, we label them as poisonous. We label them as poisonous, and we know to avoid them only because we've experienced the effects of them. And normally, we refer to something as a poison when it has a harmful effect on everyone who consumes it. There are foods that have a harmful effect on one person and not another. We don't call them poisons. For example, if you think about, and this is, using the terminology of modern medicine, think of what we refer to as allergies, food allergies. We find that one person can eat peanuts and another person is injured by them. So this is the sort of reality that Hippocrates is talking about. He would say that a healthy person is a person who can eat those things, who can eat peanuts, for example, who can eat wheat and eat wheat bread, gluten, and so on. And his body can digest and process that, make good use of it, and he can gain strength from that food. Whereas we know that that same food, when consumed by another person, causes pain, possibly even sickness, could even cause death. So this is what he means about the danger of just, going into the wild and eating raw foods like the beasts do. I've never heard of an animal that has, a peanut allergy. It seems to be a human problem. When they partake of raw foods, uncompounded, that is not mixed with other substances or other foods, and possessing strong potencies, the same things, in fact, as humans would suffer if they use them today, falling into violent pains and diseases quickly followed by death. We can see what he's referring to there. Formerly, indeed, he says, they probably suffered less because they were used to the regimen, but they suffered severely even then. So Hippocrates believes that the experience of early men was very difficult in terms of food and drink, and this forced them to try and understand what was going on and what they could eat, what they could drink without pain, without trouble, what everyone could eat, what everyone in the family could eat, what everyone in the community could eat. They had to figure that out, or find out if there were different ways of preparing things or combining things, if they could make them safe for everyone to enjoy. So this is what the early art of medicine consisted of, Hippocrates said. It meant the investigation into what could be eaten safely and how foods could be prepared so that they could be enjoyed by as many as possible. The majority of people, he says, having a weaker constitution naturally perished, while the stronger resisted longer. Just as at the present, some people deal easily with strong foods, while others do so only with severe pains and troubles. Now, one thing that's helpful to note here, I think, is that in modern circles, and I've known people, my family is a family of healthy people. But we have friends and relatives who have all sorts of problems with food and drink, and we've had to work with students and friends who have these problems and get to know about them a little bit. But what I'd like us to see here, in modern circles, when we find someone, can't eat wheat or has a problem with some food, we tend to fly into conspiracy theories about the use of chemicals on the foods, or where they're messing around with the genetics of the seed, and that's causing this problem. It's important for us to see that even in the ancient world, there were foods that were known to be difficult for different people to eat. It was known that there were different foods that caused pain and discomfort and even death if they were consumed. So we don't have to get into this political conspiracy theory talk. We can simply understand that this variety among human beings in the ability to digest different foods is just normal. It's been like this since the beginning. It's always been like this. We're not experiencing something strange. You'll hear people say, like, when could people not eat bread? Obviously everyone could have eaten bread. No, that's not true. That's not true. People couldn't always eat everything. So we need to be careful that we don't buy into some false history about how everybody used to be healthy and now everyone is sick. No, we see Hippocrates writing here that men and women have had difficult times handling different foods from the beginning. That's normal. And this is the art of medicine begins with the investigation of what foods need to be eaten or avoided or changed in their constitution so that they can be consumed and benefited from without any pain or sickness. That's one of the ordinary aims or ends of the art of medicine, is to learn what can be consumed safely by different people to promote their own health. So let's not get into all of this conspiracy theory, political propaganda stuff. Let's realize that the difficulty processing different foods by different people is normal. It's normal. And that's what, in the ancient world, that's what Hippocrates considered to be a sick person. A sick person is a person who can't eat the normal collection of foods without having some trouble. And the art of medicine begins by helping that person figure out how to obtain a sufficient diet. And we're going to see the methods and things that are used in the future in this study. So let's keep going here. He mentioned this idea of the survival of the fittest, that in the ancient world, people who were weaker, they perished. There was just nothing that could be done for them. They perished, while the stronger would resist these problems longer, just as at present. Some people deal easily with strong foods, while others do so only with many severe pains and troubles. We see this not only in food and drink, we see it in other areas as well, like let's take pollen allergies, for example. If two people can go stand in the same field, one person will hardly be able to breathe. His eyes will be watering and itching. His throat will be getting congested. He'll be sneezing and coughing. And the other person is standing in the same air perfectly fine. If Hippocrates saw a person having an allergic reaction to pollen, he would call that person a sick person, and that person would need to learn to make adjustments to his life in order to be able to work out in the field or stand in the garden without having this reaction to what is perfectly normal air. It's just harmful to him because he is sick in this ancient sense of the word sick. To continue with Hippocrates, he says, "For this reason, the ancients seem to have looked for nourishment that harmonized with the human constitution." And that's a good way of thinking about the goal here. We're looking for nourishment that harmonizes with the human constitution. And we want to understand that in a general sense so that it applies to as many people as possible, but also in a particular sense where we learn how to nourish ourselves when we find that we can't eat the normal diet. We've got to find nourishment that harmonizes with the human constitution, and to have discovered the diet we use now. So Hippocrates is saying in the 5th century BC, we're eating a diet that really is pretty complicated in the sense that we've learned a lot about the foods we eat and how to handle them, how to produce them, how to process them, how to prepare them, how to eat them, when not to eat them, in what combinations to eat them with other foods, the effect of drinks on different foods, the effect of exercise, on and on and on. The knowledge that was had in the time of Hippocrates was quite advanced and complex. And of course, in modern society, this is disrespected as if these were just a bunch of superstitious, ignorant people. And we'll find that that's not true at all. Well, I think you'll find that many of the problems we see throughout modern society, they had solutions to, but our society isn't interested in their solutions because many of them require moral virtues like self-control. And this is one of the reasons why in modern society we're not interested in ancient medicine, because it often prescribes self-control, as we'll see. So moving on here, the ancients looked for nourishment that harmonized with the human constitution and discovered the diet we use now. So, from wheat, which would be the natural product, wheat, from wheat after steeping, winnowing, grinding, sifting, kneading, and baking, the ancients learned how to make bread. And what he's saying here is the reason why they made bread was because they found, as they investigated the use of these foods and what could be done, they found forms of food and ways of preparing food that made the foods more easily digestible. So bread is an example of how human beings went from gathering wheat berries from the field and not eating them as wheat berries, but grinding them, winnowing them, sifting them, kneading them, and baking them. They produced bread which was more easily digestible, maybe even more palatable or more enjoyable to eat. And from barley, he says, they made cake. So they learned to make use of the natural products and produce nourishment that harmonized with the human constitution rather than just trying to eat things in their raw form. He goes on and says, working on food in many other ways, they boiled it or baked it or mixed it, combining the strong and uncompounded components with weaker ones, so as to adapt everything to the constitution and strength of the human being, thinking that from foods which the human constitution cannot assimilate or digest when they are ingested because they're too strong, will come pain, disease, and death. So by not preparing food properly, men suffered pain, disease, and death. And what I want you to notice here is that in this ancient medicine, when we experience pain or disease, we don't immediately need medicines or chemical remedies prescribed by pharmacists or provided by pharmacists. We may simply not be preparing our foods in a way that is agreeable to our own constitution, and we may be causing our own sickness, not because we're being invaded by, some boogeyman bacteria or virus, but simply because we're not preparing our foods in a way that agrees with our constitution. And so we can see that this can be addressed in much simpler ways than turning to all kinds of powerful chemicals and what we call medicines in modern society. The source of our troubles may be something much simpler. And we're going to see some examples he describes in just a few minutes. Some foods may simply be too strong if they're not modified in some way, either by mixture or by some kind of cooking or boiling or grinding and baking and so on. They can produce pain, disease, and death, while from such as can be assimilated will come nourishment, growth, and health. To this discovery and research, what more accurate or appropriate name could be given than medicine? This is what medicine meant in the ancient world. Just learning how to feed ourselves in a way that doesn't produce pain and sickness. This is what was called medicine in the ancient world. Seeing that it was discovered with a view to the health, salvation, and nourishment of the human being, in the place of a mode of living from which resulted pains, diseases, and death. So they found that the pains they were suffering, the diseases they were suffering, and even deaths they were experiencing were simply caused by the way that foods were being consumed. And the study of the study of nutrition, basically, in the ancient world was called medicine. And many of the problems can be eliminated. Now, if you just take a minute to think of modern nutrition, modern health, and how many problems in modern health are simply caused by what people eat and how they eat it, you'll see what Hippocrates is talking about, and you'll see that modern people don't want to listen to this kind of stuff. They don't want to be told that they shouldn't eat this, or they shouldn't fry their foods, or they shouldn't use this to cook with, and they shouldn't eat, refined foods that are high in sugars and things. They're not going to want to listen to that. They have already decided that they're going to eat in a certain way, and the way that they eat produces pain and disease, even death. But they're not interested in a remedy that requires self-control. And this is the plague of modern medicine, because money is to be made from people who simply refuse to practice what would prevent the sicknesses they suffer from. And modern medicine, because it's not really concerned with promoting health, it's primarily a business, is willing to sell the symptom blockers to these people to try and make them feel good, while they continue to bring upon themselves the cause of the sicknesses that they suffer. In the ancient world, ancient medicine was first concerned with learning how to eat in a way that prevented pains and diseases and death. A very different approach to human health, an honest and sustainable approach to human health that we should all be interested in. Section 4. That this art is commonly considered not to exist is surprising. Some people say there is no such thing as an art of medicine, but there is. Hippocrates says, "It seems unfitting to call anyone an artist in a craft in which there are no laymen." In other words, medicine in this sense is a strange art because everyone has some knowledge and experience in it. It's not like, let's say, classical astronomy, where 1% of the population might know something of the art of astronomy and 99% are completely ignorant. Nutrition and health, what Hippocrates refers to as medicine, is within the experience and knowledge to some degree with everyone. And that's why some people don't think there's an art. They think it's maybe by chance, or it's just by, everyone's different and so on. But there is, in fact, an art, Hippocrates is saying. Nevertheless, the discovery was a great one, involving much investigation and art. Indeed, even at the present day, 5th century BC, even at the present day, those who study gymnastics and athletic exercises are constantly making some fresh discovery. By investigating, according to the same method, which foods and drinks the athletes will best assimilate, and which will make him grow to his maximum strength. But let us also consider the recognized art of medicine that was discovered for the treatment of the sick, and has both a name and practitioners. Does it have any of the same objects as the other art, that is the dietetic or nutritional art? What was its origin? So now Hippocrates is getting into more along the lines of what we would consider medicine today, the actual treatment of sick people. So we have two different ideas here with respect to medicine. One simply has to do with learning how to eat properly, because that's the means of prevention. And the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we have the medicine of prevention on the one side, and then we have the medicine of cure on the other side. And anyone who's honest would want to focus on prevention, not on the cure. But there are times when knowing how to cure something is necessary. And in section 5 here, Hippocrates says, "Let us consider the recognized art of medicine that was discovered for the treatment of the sick. This is the second kind of medicine. Does it have any of the same objects as the other art? And what was its origin? He says, in my opinion, as I said at the beginning, no one would even have looked for medicine if the same regimen had suited both the sick and the healthy. So again, what motivated men to even look for knowledge of medicine was the fact that it was obvious that not everyone was healthy. Not everyone could eat the same food or drink the same drink. But different people had different needs, and there was a need to try and figure out what the cause of that sickness was and how it could be either prevented or treated. At any rate, even today, he says, people who do not make use of medical science live according to the same regimen as do those in health, just as they please, and would neither forego nor restrict the satisfaction of any of their desires. And what he's talking about here is what we see today. We see hordes of unhealthy people complaining about all of their physical problems, and we look at these people and we find they're obese, we find they eat however they please, we find they smoke, they drink, they use drugs, they have all kinds of unhealthy practices in their lives, and if anyone suggests to them removing these causes, they simply won't listen. He says, at any rate, even today, people who do not make use of medical science or knowledge live according to the same regimen as do those in health, just as they please, and would neither forego nor restrict the satisfaction of any of their desires. But those who searched for and discovered medicine, having the same intention as the people I discussed above, first lessened the bulk of the foods themselves. The first development, he says, was the lessening of the bulk of the foods, limiting their amount, reducing their amount from abundant to scanty. In other words, one of the first developments in ancient medicine was to learn that people actually need to eat less than they normally would, reducing the amount of food consumed, reducing it from abundant to scanty, because they found that the abundance of food was causing pain and disease, even death. So the first improvement in medicine, he says, is simply learning to be temperate. And we can see how virtuous living relates to physical health. The first development was to learn the importance of temperance in the health of the body. And you know the ancient phrase, all things in moderation. That's this first principle of ancient medicine, with the goal being to prevent diseases that are in our control. Hippocrates writes, although this regimen was adequate for some patients and seemed clearly to benefit them, it was not so for them all. Some patients were in such a condition that they could not assimilate even small quantities of food. In other words, they would struggle with a large quantity of food, and so for many, if the quantity was simply reduced, they could handle it and avoid sickness. But for some, even when it was reduced, they still couldn't handle it. So it wasn't just quantity. Changing the quantity didn't solve the problem for everyone. Some patients were in such a condition that they could not assimilate even small quantities of food. Since these people were evidently thought to need weaker nutriment, gruels were invented. So they started focusing on how to actually prepare the foods. So this was sort of the second development. The first development was reducing the quantity. The second development was changing the way that the food was actually prepared and consumed. They produced gruels. Gruels were invented by mixing small quantities of strong foods with much water, and by reducing their strength by compounding and boiling them. So that was a second development, learning how to weaken the foods by boiling them with water into gruels and making something more of a soup-based diet. But even further, from patients who were unable to assimilate even gruels, they withdrew these and moved to drinks, regulating them in their composition and quantity to be moderate by administering nothing that was either more or less in amount or less compounded than it should be. So you see that there was a process of simplifying and breaking the foods down in a way that made them more and more digestible. The word he uses here is capable of being assimilated. That is, the food could be broke down and turned into nutriment in the body. So they learned different ways to process foods to make them more digestible and safer for everyone to consume. Notice that we're using the same products, first in different quantities, and second in different forms, by compounding them, by really diluting them here with water in the form of gruels, or even going further and consuming them as drinks. When we talk about drinks, I know we might think of, in modern time, we might think of something like a smoothie, but I would even say something like learning to use teas, grinding foods into a powder, and then simply dissolving them into water, hot water especially, because it can absorb more, and then drinking that. The idea of a tea, which is the absorption of the substance of the food into water, and then simply drinking it as a liquid. Section 6. It must be clearly understood that patients who are not benefited in diseases by gruels, but just the opposite, on taking them suffer an exacerbation or an increase of their fever and pain. And what is taken manifestly turns out to be nourishment and increase for the disease, while for the body it leads to attrition and enfeeblement. So in some cases, it was found that the person couldn't consume the strong food, so it was broken down and served as a gruel. But even that, they sometimes found that made the person even worse. So it was more complex than just simplifying the form of the food. It seemed as if the food was actually feeding the disease rather than the person's body, and rather than producing health, was actually promoting the disease in some people. Any patients who in this condition take dry food like barley cake or bread, even a very little, will be hurt 10 times more and more obviously than if they take gruels, simply and solely because the food is too strong for their condition. And see, this is why I say in modern times, when we have people struggling to eat bread or to eat grains, to eat wheat, and so on, this is an ancient problem. And it's not because something is being done to the food to make it difficult to digest. It may simply be that an individual person has a hard time digesting this food product. And there are different ways to do that. I can think of an example. Take oatmeal. In my family, we're very healthy, very strong. We like to simply take oatmeal, crushed oats. We simply eat them as cold cereal mixed with milk. And that may be very hard for some people to digest. So obviously what most people do is they'll actually put oatmeal into water and cook it and boil it and mix it up and use that boiled water and cooking process to begin to break down the oats and make them more easily digestible. That's an example of how what Hippocrates refers to as gruels. Adding water, boiling them, breaking down the foods and making them easier to digest. Whereas a strong person could simply eat that food in its natural form. And even when I say crushed oats, even the process of just crushing the oats and making them easier to dissolve is a part of that nutritional science that helps us to eat them without having problems. And sometimes you can eat something like oatmeal, and if you eat too much of it, you'll get sick. I've experienced that myself at times, that there's an amount that's healthy, and if you go beyond that, it'll make you sick. So it's learning to find this right balance of normal foods and, using different methods of preparation of those foods to avoid and prevent sickness. That's simply caused by the food that we eat. Not by invisible boogeyman bacteria and viruses, which is how modern people begin to think, and they just drive themselves crazy. The sources of our troubles can be simple. They can be simple. A man to whom gruels are beneficial, but not to eat solid food, will suffer much more harm if he eats a larger quantity of it than if he eats only a little, although he will feel pain even if he eats a little. Indeed, all the causes of suffering, Hippocrates says, all the causes of suffering can be reduced to one, namely, it is the strongest foods. It is the strongest foods that hurt a person most and most obviously, whether he is well or ill. So that brings us to the end of section 6 here, which is what I hope to cover. And what I'd like you to see, before we get into any kind of self-diagnosis or trying to figure out what our problems are or what might be causing us to be sick and all these kinds of things, we're to understand that in this world there is a normal human diet. And just about everyone should live on the normal human diet. Some people whose bodies are strong in the sense that they're able to assimilate these foods in a most raw condition, which is obviously the easiest and the best. Those people can very easily consume and benefit from foods even in their raw forms. Other people who try to do that will make themselves sick. And the danger is to overreact and to assume that this is making me sick, therefore I can't eat it. Whereas we see Hippocrates is saying, no, that's not a necessary conclusion. You may simply need to first limit the quantity that you consume. You may need to eat a smaller quantity so that your body can handle the digestion of it. Or you may need to change the form of that normal food. You may need to make it into a gruel, like oatmeal or soup, as I mentioned before. Or even that may be too strong for you, and you need to break it down even further to the point where you're almost consuming it as a drink or as a liquid. And you can read about people doing this today. Many of these recommendations that we find in ancient medicine, we'll find them practiced today, and people will act as if they've made this great breakthrough. You'll hear people today, for example, talk about souping, where we'll find that some celebrity with a beautiful body that's healthy and fit, we'll say, oh, this person's healthy. Look how fit their body is. Whereas, as we saw, that's not what it means to be healthy. We'll find that person is able to keep themselves fit and feeling good by what's called souping, which means simply eating foods in the form of soups rather than solid foods. Now, Hippocrates would call that a sign of sickness because they are not able to eat the foods in their natural form. They need to break them down and use a simpler form to consume. So Hippocrates would call that sickness. But what they're doing, Hippocrates would call good. He would call that good medicine because they're learning how to manage the foods that they eat so that they can eat them without suffering any pain or sickness from them. And that's really the first step of the art of medicine, is simply learning how to consume normal foods in a way that doesn't make us sick. And we can't all assume that we should be able to eat things the same way that other people do. That doesn't mean we need to change our whole diet. And, often when I hear people talking about things like the inability to consume gluten, things like that, I'll often hear them say, I can't eat gluten, therefore I'm going to eat something else. Where you can see Hippocrates would say, no, that's going too far. You don't have to say I can't eat gluten just because eating some hearty raw wheat bread makes you feel sick. That doesn't mean you're gluten intolerant. It may simply mean you need to consume that food in a different way, or in a different quantity, or in a different concentration, and still be able to make use of that simple, common food without going into some crazy overreaction to the problem, which really isn't that big of a deal. My wife has an example. My wife has something like this. She's unable to consume eggs. So if she was just to hard boil some eggs or make a plate of scrambled eggs, the eggs would make her sick. Her stomach would bloat. She would feel terrible. That's the kind of reaction to food that Hippocrates is talking about here. So my wife, however, does find that she can eat eggs in foods. In other words, as Hippocrates said, compounded with other foods. If she adds eggs to things like, let's say, something like French toast, where you'll use an egg dip to make the French toast, she can eat French toast, but she can't eat a plate of scrambled eggs. It's just a matter of quantity and composition. That's the sort of thing that Hippocrates is talking about. We don't need to change our whole diet. We may need to learn how to consume ordinary foods in different ways and in different quantities so that our body isn't hurt by them. And that's a very simple way, I think, to think about what Hippocrates is teaching us. And if you reflect on that, you'll probably be able to think of ways you already do that, but we simply don't make it a focus because we don't think of medicine being this art of learning how to manage the consumption of ordinary foods in different ways to make them more easily digestible to us. And I wonder how many of us are suffering from problems or responding to some problems in an overly extreme way rather than thinking as Hippocrates teaches us to think about our food here. Have you tried consuming the same foods in different forms? Have you tried consuming the same foods in composition with other foods? Have you tried consuming the foods in different forms, like as a gruel or a soup rather than a solid, or even as a drink, where you can still get the same nutriment from the food but in a different form? There are things like this for us to think about and experiment with so that we can try and identify what exactly the cause of sickness may be and find a relatively simple solution to it rather than immediately jumping off the ship and going into all kinds of changes and extraordinary diets and foods and pulling things from all over the place, which isn't even sustainable. It's something we can mess around with these things in America because we have such an abundance and variety because of our economy, but it's not even a sustainable plan for how to live. And we've got to ask ourselves, is there a simpler solution that simply isn't a part of what we consider modern nutrition and medicine? And that's what Hippocrates recommends here at the beginning of this ancient medicine. The simplest idea of medicine is simply learning how to eat, to avoid sicknesses that are caused by trying to eat foods that are too strong or in a form that's too difficult for our bodies to process without making us feel sick. So I'm going to cut off here at the end of section 6. Please note as I wrap up here and we talk about these things, I want to be able to talk about these things freely, but you know that I'm not making any recommendations or giving any medical counsel in these talks. We're simply reading the ancient medicine by Hippocrates and learning from an ancient wise physician and comparing what's done and taught in modern medicine with what was understood and taught in ancient medicine. So hopefully someone who is struggling under modern medicine can find an alternative that might be helpful. Or someone who is making use of a remedy or a treatment that's very expensive and difficult, inconvenient, and so on, just distracting from ordinary life, can possibly find a simpler solution that really does the same thing. So that's what I'm hoping that you can find in ancient medicine, because I think it addresses the real issues, things like eating temperately, learning to control the quantities of the food you consume, learning to consume food in a different format, even if you don't like it as much, but because it's better for you to do so. Learning to have that self-control, that temperance, and possibly eliminate some of your troubles simply by changing the quantity or the way that you eat food. So I hope that's helpful. If there's anything in here you'd like to talk about, any questions you have, feel free to get in touch. But we'll continue in our study of Hippocrates' ancient medicine. Probably within the next week, I'll post a new talk, and we'll just continue making our way through. I think there are 24 sections, and we're through 6 so far, so this won't go on too long, and I hope it will continue to be helpful and interesting. I hope that is helpful. God bless your studies.